You ever walk into your own house and immediately know something's wrong? I'm not talking about forgetting to take the trash out or stepping in a puddle of melted ice cream the kids left on the floor. No, this was different, like the air was heavier, charged, but you couldn't quite figure out why. That's how I felt the second I walked in last Friday. It wasn't a particularly eventful day, just your regular end-of-the-week grind. I left work a bit early, thinking I'd surprise Michelle and the kids. Maybe have a quiet family night, pizza, movie, nothing fancy. But as soon as I pushed open the front door, I knew something was off. First clue? Silence. Now, if you've got kids like mine, you know silence in a house isn't a blessing, it's a warning. Like, someone's either doing something they shouldn't, or something's happened. Jack and Emma weren't around. Michelle's car was in the driveway, though. So, naturally, I figured she was upstairs, maybe taking a nap after a long day. But then I noticed something odd. Her favorite wine, Chardonnay, was open on the kitchen counter, half a bottle missing. And there were 2 glasses sitting next to it. 2 glasses. Not one. I froze. The logical part of my brain tried to make excuses. Maybe she had a friend over, I told myself. Maybe it was her sister, or one of her girlfriends, who liked to drop by unannounced. But something didn't feel right. I stepped further into the house, my heartbeat starting to pick up. As I moved into the living room, that's when I saw it, Michelle's work bag on the floor, its contents spilled out like someone had knocked it over in a hurry. Her laptop was there, and next to it, a crumpled shirt. A man's shirt. Now, this is where I should have probably stopped, taken a deep breath, and calmed myself down. But I didn't. I kept walking, my feet dragging me toward the stairs, even though a voice in my head was screaming at me to turn around. And then I heard it. A sound that made my stomach drop. Laughter. Coming from upstairs. Her laughter. The kind that used to be reserved for me. The laughter stopped me cold, halfway up the stairs. It was light, playful, her laugh. It should have been a comforting sound, one I used to hear when she was with me, back in the days when everything was normal. But hearing it now, muffled and distant, sent a jolt of anger through me. I stood there, just listening, every fiber of my body on edge. I wanted to storm up the rest of the way, kick open the door, and demand an explanation. But I didn't. I don't know why. Maybe because I wasn't ready for what I knew was waiting on the other side. Instead, I moved quietly, creeping up the stairs as if making too much noise would shatter the thin layer of denial I was still clinging to. By the time I reached the top, I could hear voices, hers and his. A man's voice, low and too casual for my liking. They were talking, laughing like it was nothing. As if this was just a regular day for them. I moved closer to the bedroom door, and that's when I heard her say something that ripped right through me. I needed this, she said, her voice soft but clear. God, I've missed you. I felt my heart race, the blood pumping in my ears so loud it drowned out the rest of their conversation. I stood there, my hand hovering over the doorknob, not knowing whether I should kick the door down or just walk away. Part of me hoped that if I opened it, it'd be something innocent, something I could explain away. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. I took a step back. I didn't want to be the guy who just burst in and made a scene, at least not yet. I needed to know exactly what was going on. My hand instinctively reached into my pocket, pulling out my phone. I don't know what came over me, but I set it to record, just in case. Maybe it was to protect myself from later second-guessing what I was about to witness. I wasn't ready for what came next. The door was slightly ajar, just enough to give me a view of the bed. There she was, lying there, half covered by the sheets, her hair a mess, looking relaxed in a way I hadn't seen in a long time. But it wasn't the sight of her that made my blood boil, it was the man next to her. Some guy, younger than me by at least 5 years, sprawled out on my side of the bed, shirtless, with that smug, satisfied look on his face. His arm was lazily draped over her waist, like he had every right to be there. My bed, my wife, and this random asshole acting like he owned the place. I felt a rush of adrenaline, my fists clenching involuntarily. My entire body was telling me to barge in and rip him apart, to demand answers, to make her explain right there on the spot. But I stayed rooted to the floor. The shock was still holding me back, forcing me to process this sickening scene unfolding right in front of me. "Are you sure about this?" the guy asked, his voice casual, like this was just another hookup. No guilt, no hesitation. He clearly didn't give a damn about the wreckage he was creating. She sighed, but not in a sad or conflicted way, more like she was thinking about something trivial. "I don't know what I'm sure about anymore," she replied. "It's just, I needed something different. Something different." That's what I was to her now. Some stale, outdated version of what she wanted. I wanted to scream at her, to barge in and make her see what she'd done, how she'd torn apart the life we'd built together. But I didn't. I couldn't. Instead, I took a deep breath and stepped back from the door. My mind was racing with 1,000 thoughts: anger, disbelief, and a strange sense of finality. I knew this wasn't something I could come back from. You don't just shrug off walking in on your wife with another man. Still, I wasn't ready for the confrontation. Not yet. I needed time to process, to figure out my next move. I turned around and walked back down the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. I needed to think. I needed to understand how the hell this had happened. When I reached the living room, I stood there for a moment, looking around at the remnants of the life we had built together. The family photos on the wall, the kids' toys scattered around. It all felt like a sick joke now. How long had this been going on? How many times had she lied to me, pretending everything was fine while she was sneaking around behind my back? I went to the kitchen and grabbed a beer from the fridge, not because I was thirsty, but because I needed something to do with my hands. My mind was spinning, trying to piece together the puzzle of when this had all started. Her late nights at work, the random business trips she claimed were mandatory. I'd never questioned any of it. I was an idiot for trusting her so blindly. But that was the thing about trust: it's not something you just hand over lightly. It's something that builds over time, layer by layer. And now, all of it had come crashing down in an instant. The woman I had spent nearly a decade with, the mother of my children, had betrayed me in the worst way possible. I finished the beer and tossed the bottle into the trash, not caring about the noise it made. I wasn't trying to be quiet anymore. Part of me wanted her to hear me, to know that I was downstairs, that I knew. But I couldn't confront her yet. Not like this. I needed to think, to plan. I grabbed my phone and looked at the recording, my hands shaking. The proof was there, all captured in a few painful minutes. It was real, not some nightmare I could wake up from. This was my reality now. I sat down at the kitchen table, staring at the phone. The anger was still there, burning in my chest, but now it was mixed with something else: cold, calculated focus. I wasn't just going to confront her. I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of some emotional outburst where she could twist things around or start crying to get out of it. No, I was going to make this hurt. I was going to make sure she felt every ounce of the betrayal I was feeling. I sat there for hours, formulating a plan. It wasn't going to be quick, and it wasn't going to be easy. But it would be satisfying. I don't know how long I sat at that kitchen table, replaying everything I'd just seen in my head. It was like I was frozen, stuck between disbelief and rage, unsure of which would push me over the edge first. The worst part was the calmness I felt, as if the reality of what I had just witnessed hadn't sunk in yet. But that was about to change. Michelle came down the stairs a few hours later, the sound of her footsteps snapping me out of my daze. I didn't move, didn't say anything as she entered the kitchen. Her hair was still messy, like she hadn't even bothered to make herself presentable after being with that guy. She didn't see me at first, her eyes fixed on the fridge as she pulled out a bottle of water. When she finally turned around, she froze. Our eyes locked. For a second, she looked like a deer caught in headlights, like she hadn't expected me to be there, or maybe she had thought I'd be asleep by now. The guilt on her face was unmistakable, but she quickly tried to mask it, putting on that fake smile she always used when she wanted to act like everything was fine. "Hey, you're up late," she said casually, taking a sip from her bottle as if nothing had happened. As if she hadn't just spent the last few hours upstairs with another man in our bed. I stayed silent for a moment, just watching her. Waiting. I could feel the tension in the room thickening with every passing second, but she still kept up the act, like she was hoping this was just another ordinary night. "Who's upstairs, Michelle?" I finally asked, my voice low but steady. I didn't need to raise it. The weight of the question alone was enough to make her flinch. She blinked, her fake smile faltering for a moment before she recovered. "What are you talking about?" she asked, trying to sound confused, but her voice wavered. She was a terrible liar, and right now, she knew she was caught. I pushed my chair back and stood up, slowly, deliberately, making sure she felt every ounce of the anger I'd been bottling up. I wasn't going to let her squirm out of this with some half-assed excuse. "Not this time." "I heard you," I said, my voice cold. "I heard both of you." Her face went pale, and the bottle of water slipped from her hand, crashing onto the floor. She stood there, frozen, her mouth opening and closing like she was trying to come up with something, anything, to get herself out of this. I don't know what you're. Don't lie to me," I cut her off, taking a step toward her. "I heard everything, Michelle. I saw him. I saw you with him. So don't you dare stand there and pretend like you don't know what I'm talking about." Her eyes widened, and for a second, I thought she might start crying, but she didn't. Instead, she swallowed hard and looked away, as if the floor was suddenly the most interesting thing in the room. I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Sorry?" I repeated, my fists clenching at my sides. "That's it? That's all you have to say?" She finally looked back at me, her eyes wet but still no tears. "Adam, please, I didn't mean for this to happen." I cut her off again, my voice rising this time. "You didn't mean for this to happen? What the hell does that even mean? You didn't trip and fall into bed with some random guy, Michelle. This wasn't a fucking accident." Her face twisted in some pathetic attempt at remorse, but it wasn't working. "Not on me. I wasn't buying any of it." She took a step toward me, reaching out like she wanted to touch me, but I backed away, the disgust clear on my face. "I swear, it wasn't what it looked like," she said, her voice shaking. It didn't mean anything. It was just. I don't know. I was just confused." "Confused?" I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You don't accidentally end up in bed with someone because you're confused, Michelle. You knew exactly what you were doing." Tears started to fall now, but they didn't move me. I'd seen enough fake apologies in my life to know when someone was trying to manipulate me. And right now, that's all this was. A weak attempt to turn the situation around and make herself the victim. I wasn't happy, she blurted out suddenly, as if that explained everything. "I've been so unhappy, Adam. I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't know what else to do." "Oh, so this is my fault now?" I snapped, taking another step toward her. She flinched again, but I didn't care. "You were unhappy, so instead of talking to me, you decided to fuck someone else? That's your solution?" She shook her head, sobbing now, her shoulders trembling as she tried to speak. "No, it's not like that. It's not your fault, I needed something. I needed to feel something again." "Feel something?" I scoffed, my hands shaking with rage. "What the fuck are you talking about? You're married. We have kids. We've built a life together, and you're telling me you needed to feel something? So what, screwing some guy behind my back made you feel better about your shitty life?" She cried harder, covering her face with her hands. "I didn't mean to hurt you," she sobbed, her voice muffled. "I swear, Adam, I didn't mean for any of this to happen." "Then why did it?" I demanded, slamming my fist down on the table. She jumped at the noise, but I didn't care. I was past the point of caring. If you didn't mean for it to happen, then why did you let it? How long has this been going on? She didn't answer at first, just stood there, shaking and crying like a pathetic mess. When she finally looked up at me, her face was streaked with tears, but there was something in her eyes, something that made my blood run cold. A few months, she whispered, barely loud enough for me to hear. I froze. A few months? She'd been lying to me for months, pretending everything was fine while she was sneaking around with some random guy? I couldn't stop myself. I lashed out, grabbing the nearest chair and flinging it across the kitchen. It crashed into the wall, the sound echoing through the house. Michelle screamed, backing away from me like she thought I was going to hit her. But I didn't. I wasn't going to give her that satisfaction. I wasn't going to become the monster she probably wanted me to be so she could play the victim. Instead, I turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving her standing there in her mess of tears and lies. I needed air. I needed space. I needed to get the hell out of this house before I did something I'd regret. But I wasn't done with her. Not by a long shot. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. When I left the house that night, I didn't know where I was going. My mind was a storm, a mess of thoughts that didn't seem to make any sense. I just knew I had to get out, had to escape the sight of her sobbing, pathetic form. It was already past midnight, and the streets were quiet, as if the world itself didn't care about the mess my life had just turned into. I walked for what felt like hours, my fists clenched and my jaw tight. The whole time, I was replaying everything she'd said in my head. The excuses, the weak explanations, her blaming it all on her so-called unhappiness. It was like a broken record, skipping over the same bullshit over and over again. None of it made sense. How could someone do this? How could she do this? By the time I finally made it back home, it was nearly 3 a.m. I was exhausted, but not the kind of tired that makes you want to sleep. It was the kind that makes you want to tear everything apart. And that's exactly what I was going to do, tear everything apart. But not the way you might think. No, I wasn't going to smash windows or rip up furniture. That would have been too easy, too short-lived. I wanted something bigger, something that would stay with her forever. Revenge wasn't about rage. It was about control. It was about making sure that she felt every bit of pain that I was feeling, but in a way that she couldn't shake off with a few fake tears and empty apologies. I wasn't going to give her that out. I was going to make her regret ever thinking she could get away with this. First thing I did was sit down at my computer. I knew I had to be smart about this, take my time. I wasn't some impulsive idiot who was going to fly off the handle without a plan. That's not how I was wired. I was calm, methodical, and now that the shock had worn off, I was ready to start piecing together exactly how I was going to destroy her life, piece by piece. I started with her phone. She had been careless, leaving it in the kitchen when she went upstairs to sleep. I hadn't touched it earlier because I was too wrapped up in my own fury, but now, I saw it for what it was, a weapon, one that I could use to tear apart everything she thought she could keep hidden. Michelle wasn't very tech-savvy. She always had the same passwords for everything, some combination of our kids' names and our anniversary date. It didn't take long for me to break into her phone and start scrolling through her messages, her apps, her emails. I wasn't surprised by what I found. There were conversations with him, of course. The guy upstairs. Jason, I learned his name was. Jason fucking Malone. The messages between them weren't even subtle. They were brazen, as if she didn't care about getting caught. She talked to him like she was some giddy teenager sneaking around with her first crush, not like a grown woman with a husband and kids. It was disgusting, reading through how they planned their meetups, how she'd lie about where she was going, how they'd laugh about me like I was some clueless idiot. My stomach turned, but I pushed through it. I took screenshots of everything. Every message, every picture, every stupid little heart emoji she sent him. I saved them to a file, labeled it with her name, and sent it to myself. If I was going to ruin her, I needed to be thorough. After I had everything I needed from her phone, I started thinking about the next step. It wasn't enough just to confront her with the evidence. She would cry, beg, and probably try to manipulate me again. I needed something bigger. I wanted to hit her where it hurt, not just emotionally but financially, socially, everywhere. I wasn't going to let her walk away from this with her life intact. I spent the next few days pretending like everything was fine. It wasn't easy, but I kept my cool. I needed to. Michelle, of course, tried to act like she was sorry, like she was going to make things right between us. She cooked dinner, asked about my day, even tried to initiate sex once. I couldn't help but laugh at that. The idea of touching her now made me sick to my core. But I played along. I told her I needed time to think, that I wasn't sure what I wanted to do yet. It gave me the space I needed to set things up without her getting suspicious. I made sure to keep things calm at home, for the kids' sake. They didn't need to see this mess unfold just yet. They were innocent in all this, and I didn't want them caught in the crossfire. Not until I was ready to pull the trigger. During those few days, I went about gathering more ammunition. I met with a lawyer, a shark, the best divorce attorney I could find. I laid out the situation, told him about the affair, the texts, the emails, everything. He didn't even flinch. This was routine for him, but for me, it was the first time I felt like I had some control back in my life. We drew up a plan: file for divorce, fight for full custody, and hit her hard financially. He told me about her options, how we could leverage the affair against her, how I could potentially walk away with the house, the savings, everything. Michelle wouldn't know what hit her. I knew it was going to be ugly, but I didn't care. This wasn't about playing nice anymore. This was war. But that wasn't all. I had one more part of my plan, something a little more personal. I wasn't just going to ruin her legally or financially. I was going to ruin her reputation, too. You see, Michelle wasn't just a regular mom. She was the PTA president at our kids' school, heavily involved in community events, well liked by all the other parents. She had this image, this persona she loved to put on like some saintly figure who had everything together. That was about to come crashing down. I took everything I had, the screenshots, the texts, the pictures, and I made copies. I printed them out, carefully organizing them into packets. It wasn't hard to figure out who needed to see them. A few of the moms from the PTA, the school board, and, of course, her closest friends. I knew once they saw what she'd been up to, there'd be no coming back for her. The gossip in our town spread faster than wildfire, and Michelle was about to become the subject of every conversation. I wasn't done there, though. Jason, her little plaything, he wasn't getting off easy either. Turns out, he had a wife. I found her on Facebook, and it didn't take much effort to gather her contact details. I sent her everything, every dirty detail of their affair. I wasn't going to let this guy walk away scot-free. He had a family, too, and I was more than happy to see it destroyed just like mine. By the time I was done, I had everything in place. The lawyer had filed the papers, the evidence was ready to be distributed, and I was calm. Collected. I wasn't the same guy who had stormed out of the house that night, fists clenched in rage. I was someone else now. Someone with a plan. The final part of my revenge came on a Friday. I waited until the kids were at school, and Michelle was home. She had the day off, of course. Probably planning to see Jason, but I had different plans for her. I walked into the living room, the divorce papers in hand, and tossed them on the coffee table in front of her. She looked up from her phone, her eyes widening when she saw the stack of papers, thick and official looking. What's this?" she stammered, reaching for the documents with trembling hands. "It's over," I said simply, sitting down across from her. "I'm filing for divorce. And trust me, Michelle, you're not going to like how this plays out." She flipped through the papers, her face growing paler by the second. "But, Adam, we can fix this. We can go to counseling, we can." I laughed, cutting her off. "Counseling? Are you serious? You think some therapist is going to fix what you did? No, Michelle. There's no fixing this. I've already talked to a lawyer. I've got everything I need." Her eyes filled with tears, and she looked up at me, desperate. "But the kids, what about the kids?" "You should have thought about that before you decided to fuck Jason," I snapped, my voice ice cold. "You think I'm going to let you keep them? After everything you've done? No. They're coming with me." She started crying then, real, loud sobs that filled the room. But I didn't care. I felt nothing for her anymore, no sympathy, no remorse. This was the consequence of her actions, and I was done being the guy who played nice. I stood up, watching her crumble in front of me. Oh, and by the way, I added, my tone casual, almost amused. You might want to check in with the PTA. I'm sure your friends will love the surprise I sent them. Her head snapped up, eyes wide with horror. What did you do? I smiled, satisfied. You'll find out soon enough. I turned and walked out of the house, leaving her behind in the wreckage of her own making. After I left the house, I didn't look back. I wasn't the same person I had been just a week ago, and I knew it. Whatever version of me had existed before husband, father, the guy who trusted his wife, was gone. I didn't feel like I'd lost anything, though. In a strange way, I felt lighter, like I had finally dropped the weight of living a lie. The divorce papers were filed, the evidence was out there, and I had everything in place. I thought it would feel like victory, like I'd won some kind of battle, but the satisfaction didn't last. Maybe that's just how it goes when you're dealing with betrayal. You don't feel like you've won, even when you're the one who took control. The truth is, nobody wins when the life you built gets torn apart like this. I wasn't done with Michelle, though. There was still one last thing we needed to talk about, the kids. Jack and Emma had been blissfully unaware of the shitstorm brewing between their parents. They didn't know that their world was about to come crashing down, and that weighed on me more than anything else. Whatever Michelle had done, they were innocent in all of it, and I needed to figure out how to break it to them without shattering their sense of security. A few days after the confrontation, I told Michelle we needed to sit down and talk. She hadn't been the same since I served her the divorce papers. She looked like a wreck, barely eating or sleeping. She stayed home, moping around the house, trying to avoid me as much as possible. I guess she was hoping I'd change my mind, or maybe she thought I'd calm down. Either way, she was wrong. We arranged to meet after the kids went to bed. I didn't want them overhearing any of this. It was a cold, rainy night, fitting for the way everything had been falling apart. She was waiting for me in the living room, sitting on the couch with her arms wrapped around herself like she was trying to hold herself together. I didn't sit down. I wasn't in the mood for getting comfortable. We need to talk about the kids, I said, standing in front of her with my arms crossed. She looked up at me, her eyes red from crying. I know, she whispered. But, Adam, can't we please talk about us first? We can fix this. We can go to therapy, we can. Stop, I cut her off, my voice firm. There's no fixing this, Michelle. I'm not here to rehash what you did. I'm done with that conversation. The only thing left to discuss is how we handle Jack and Emma. She looked like she was going to argue, but she bit her lip and nodded. Okay, she said softly. What do you want to do? I sighed, feeling the weight of the conversation settle onto my shoulders. They need to know, I said. We can't keep pretending everything's fine. It's not fair to them. We have to tell them the truth about the divorce, about how things are going to change. Michelle flinched at the word divorce, like it was a slap in the face. But she didn't protest. She knew this was the end. How do we tell them? She asked, her voice trembling. What do we say? I thought about it for a long time before answering. We tell them the basics, I said. That we're getting divorced, and that it's not their fault. We don't get into the details. They don't need to know about your affair. The word affair felt like poison in my mouth, but I forced it out. They don't need to know the ugly parts. Michelle nodded, tears streaming down her face. I don't want to lose them, she whispered, her voice barely audible. You should have thought about that before you fucked Jason, I shot back, my tone colder than I intended. But I didn't apologize. She needed to hear it. She broke down then, sobbing into her hands. I stood there, watching her, feeling nothing. No sympathy, no anger, just emptiness. This was what she had chosen. She had destroyed everything we had, and now she was crying because she didn't like the consequences. I didn't have any patience for her tears. "We'll tell them tomorrow," I said flatly. "Together. They need to hear it from both of us." She nodded through her sobs, unable to speak. I left her there, alone in the living room, and went upstairs to my own room, the room that used to be ours. I lay down on the bed, staring up at the ceiling, trying to figure out how I was going to explain all this to my kids. How do you tell your children that their parents are splitting up? How do you explain that their mom chose some guy over the family? The next day was one of the hardest of my life. Michelle and I sat Jack and Emma down in the living room, their innocent faces looking up at us with confusion. They didn't know what was coming, didn't understand why their parents were acting so strange. We hadn't been arguing in front of them, hadn't been yelling or slamming doors, so they had no clue the storm that was about to hit. "Mom and Dad need to talk to you guys about something important," I started, my voice steady despite the nerves twisting in my gut. Jack, always the more observant one, frowned. "What's wrong?" he asked. "You guys look weird." Michelle wiped her eyes, trying to pull herself together. I shot her a glance, silently warning her not to fall apart in front of the kids. She nodded, taking a deep breath. "Your dad and we've decided that we're going to get a divorce," she said, her voice cracking on the last word. The look on Jack's face was one I'll never forget. Shock, confusion, and then a flood of emotions he didn't know how to process. Emma, on the other hand, just started crying immediately, the tears streaming down her face as she clung to my arm. "Why?" Jack asked, his voice trembling. "Why are you getting divorced?" I glanced at Michelle, silently telling her to let me handle this. "Sometimes, grown-ups, sometimes we have problems that we can't fix," I explained, trying to keep my voice calm. "It doesn't have anything to do with you guys. We both love you very much, and we're still going to be here for you. But things between me and your mom, they're not working anymore." Emma sobbed harder, and Jack looked like he was about to explode with anger. "This doesn't make any sense," he shouted, his hands balled into fists. "You guys never even fight. How can you get divorced if you're not fighting?" I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his words hit me like a punch to the gut. He was right, we hadn't been fighting. I'd kept everything under wraps for their sake, and now they were blindsided. They had no idea that the cracks in our marriage had been growing for months, years even. "We didn't want to fight in front of you," I said quietly. "We wanted to protect you from all of this. But the truth is, sometimes things happen between adults that kids can't see. And this is one of those things." Jack shook his head, tears welling up in his eyes. "This isn't fair," he whispered, his voice breaking. "This isn't fair." I wanted to agree with him, to tell him how unfair this all was, but I couldn't. I had to be the strong one, had to keep it together for them. "Life isn't always fair, Jack," I said softly. "But your mom and I are going to do everything we can to make sure you and Emma are okay. You'll still see both of us, and we're still going to be your parents. That's not going to change." Emma, still clinging to me, looked up through her tears. "But, are you and Mommy still going to live together?" That question hit me harder than anything else. How do you explain to a little girl that her family is being torn apart, that the home she knows will never be the same? "No, sweetie," Michelle answered, her voice shaky. "We won't be living together anymore. But you'll still see both of us, okay? We'll work out a schedule so you can spend time with both me and Daddy." Emma's sobs grew louder, and I felt my own heart breaking. She didn't deserve this. None of them did. The rest of the conversation was a blur. Jack stormed off to his room, slamming the door behind him, and Emma eventually fell asleep in my arms from exhaustion. Michelle sat there, her face pale and her eyes hollow, as if she had finally realized the full extent of what she had done. I carried Emma to her room, tucking her into bed and kissing her forehead. As I stood there, watching her sleep, I felt the weight of everything I'd lost. My marriage, my family, my life as I knew it. It was all gone. And yet, I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even sad. I was just tired. Tired of fighting, tired of pretending, tired of living in the wreckage of someone else's choices. It was time to move on. time to rebuild, to start over. When I went back downstairs, Michelle was still sitting on the couch, staring at the divorce papers I'd left on the table. She looked up as I approached, her eyes red and swollen from crying. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice small and broken. I stood there for a moment, considering her question. What happens now? The truth was, I didn't know. But one thing was clear: whatever happened next, it was going to be without her. "I move out," I said simply. "You sign those papers, and we figure out the rest." She nodded, defeated, and I turned to leave the room. As I reached the doorway, I stopped, turning back to face her one last time. "I'll always be there for the kids," I said, my voice steady. "But for you, Michelle, this is it. We're done." With that, I walked out, closing the door on the life I once had. I moved out of the house the next morning. I didn't bother with a big farewell, no dramatic goodbyes or lingering glances at the life I was leaving behind. It didn't feel like my home anymore, hadn't for a while, if I was being honest with myself. Michelle stayed in the kitchen, pretending to clean while I packed my things. I think she was afraid to watch me leave, afraid of what it really meant. But that didn't stop her from watching from the corner of her eye, seeing everything come undone as I stuffed my life into boxes. It was a quiet, methodical process. I took only what I needed: clothes, work stuff, personal items, and left the rest. We'd sort out the bigger things later, but at that moment, all I cared about was getting the hell out of that house. The silence between us was louder than anything we could have said, and I wasn't in the mood to break it. The last thing I grabbed was my phone charger from the bedroom. Our bedroom. When I walked in, I was hit by the familiar scent of her perfume, still lingering in the air. It made me pause, just for a second, thinking about all the nights we'd spent together in that room. The good times, before everything went to shit. There was a time when this space had been something of a sanctuary for us, where we laughed, argued, made up, and lived the life we thought we had. Now, it just felt like a crime scene. I looked at the bed, our bed, and all I could see was him. Jason. The thought of him lying there with her, in the same spot where I had shared years of my life, where we'd made our children, was enough to make me sick. But I forced it down. I had to. This was the last time I'd stand in this room, and I wasn't going to let it break me. With one final glance, I walked out, feeling lighter with every step I took toward the front door. Michelle was still in the kitchen, her back to me, scrubbing the same spot on the counter over and over again. I could have said something, given her some parting words, but there was nothing left to say. Instead, I just left. Simple as that. I stayed at a motel for the first couple of nights, just until I figured out where I was going to settle. It wasn't fancy, but it didn't matter. I wasn't looking for comfort. I needed space to think, to process everything. Those nights were spent lying on a stiff mattress, staring up at a ceiling that didn't remind me of anything. That's what I needed most: something that wasn't tied to a memory, something that didn't make me feel anything at all. In the quiet of that room, with the hum of the motel's broken AC as my only companion, I started thinking about everything that had happened. The affair. The lies. The confrontation. The revenge. It had all moved so fast, like I was on some kind of autopilot, just reacting to everything as it came. But now, with nothing but time on my hands, I started asking myself the questions I'd been avoiding. Had I really won? Sure, I'd gotten my revenge. Michelle was a wreck, her social life in ruins. Jason's marriage was likely shattered after I sent his wife the evidence. The divorce was moving forward, and the kids would be staying with me most of the time. From the outside, it might look like I came out on top. But sitting there in that empty motel room, it didn't feel like victory. What I felt was tired. Exhausted, actually. I had spent so much energy trying to get back at her, trying to make her pay for what she'd done, that I hadn't thought about what came after. After all the yelling, after the papers were signed, after the kids found a new routine, what then? What was my life going to look like now? The motel was a temporary solution, of course. I couldn't stay there forever, and it wasn't a place for the kids. So I found an apartment, a small but decent 2-bedroom place not too far from their school. It was nothing special, but it was clean, affordable, and, most importantly, it was mine. I moved in within a week, buying the bare essentials, furniture, kitchen stuff, things to make it livable. It wasn't home, not yet, but it was a start. The first weekend the kids came over was rough. They were still adjusting to the idea that their parents weren't together anymore, that things would never go back to the way they were. Jack was still angry, still holding everything in, refusing to talk about what had happened. He spent most of his time in his room, only coming out for meals and barely saying a word. Emma was different. She cried the first night, crawling into bed with me, asking over and over again why things had to change. I didn't have a good answer for her, so I just held her, telling her that everything was going to be okay, even though I wasn't sure it would be. That's when it hit me, I guess. I'd been so focused on the revenge, so fixated on making Michelle suffer, that I hadn't thought about the real consequences. The kids. Their world had been torn apart, too, and it wasn't just Michelle's fault. I'd played a part in it. I couldn't pretend like they weren't affected by my actions. One night, after I'd put Emma to bed, I sat down at the kitchen table with Jack. He was scrolling through his phone, pretending not to notice me, but I wasn't going to let him off the hook this time. "Jack, we need to talk," I said, keeping my voice steady. He didn't look up, just kept staring at the screen. "About what?" "You know about what," I replied, leaning forward. "About the divorce. About everything." He sighed, tossing his phone onto the table. "What's there to talk about? You and Mom hate each other now, and we're stuck in the middle." "I get it." I winced at the bitterness in his voice. "It's not that simple, Jack. Your mom and I don't hate each other. Things just changed." "Yeah, things changed because Mom cheated," he snapped, his eyes flashing with anger. "She ruined everything." I nodded slowly, taking in his words. "She made a mistake," I said carefully. "A big one. But that doesn't mean we can't move forward. We're still a family, even if it doesn't look the same as it used to." You ever walk into your own house and immediately know something's wrong? I'm not talking about forgetting to take the trash out or stepping in a puddle of melted ice cream the kids left on the floor. No, this was different, like the air was heavier, charged, but you couldn't quite figure out why. That's how I felt the second I walked in last Friday. It wasn't a particularly eventful day, just your regular end-of-the-week grind. I left work a bit early, thinking I'd surprise Michelle and the kids. Maybe have a quiet family night, pizza, movie, nothing fancy. But as soon as I pushed open the front door, I knew something was off. First clue? Silence. Now, if you've got kids like mine, you know silence in a house isn't a blessing, it's a warning. Like, someone's either doing something they shouldn't, or something's happened. Jack and Emma weren't around. Michelle's car was in the driveway, though. So, naturally, I figured she was upstairs, maybe taking a nap after a long day. But then I noticed something odd. Her favorite wine, Chardonnay, was open on the kitchen counter, half a bottle missing. And there were 2 glasses sitting next to it. 2 glasses. Not one. I froze. The logical part of my brain tried to make excuses. Maybe she had a friend over, I told myself. Maybe it was her sister, or one of her girlfriends, who liked to drop by unannounced. But something didn't feel right. I stepped further into the house, my heartbeat starting to pick up. As I moved into the living room, that's when I saw it, Michelle's work bag on the floor, its contents spilled out like someone had knocked it over in a hurry. Her laptop was there, and next to it, a crumpled shirt. A man's shirt. Now, this is where I should have probably stopped, taken a deep breath, and calmed myself down. But I didn't. I kept walking, my feet dragging me toward the stairs, even though a voice in my head was screaming at me to turn around. And then I heard it. A sound that made my stomach drop. Laughter. Coming from upstairs. Her laughter. The kind that used to be reserved for me. The laughter stopped me cold, halfway up the stairs. It was light, playful, her laugh. It should have been a comforting sound, one I used to hear when she was with me, back in the days when everything was normal. But hearing it now, muffled and distant, sent a jolt of anger through me. I stood there, just listening, every fiber of my body on edge. I wanted to storm up the rest of the way, kick open the door, and demand an explanation. But I didn't. I don't know why. Maybe because I wasn't ready for what I knew was waiting on the other side. Instead, I moved quietly, creeping up the stairs as if making too much noise would shatter the thin layer of denial I was still clinging to,